On the edge of the misty town of Ravenscroft lay an ancient dockyard, long abandoned and left to rot. The locals called it the Forgotten Dockyard, a name whispered with dread and unease. Once a thriving port for merchant ships, it had fallen into ruin after a series of inexplicable disappearances and tragedies over a century ago. The dockyard had since been left untouched, swallowed by time and nature, save for the occasional gust of wind that stirred its broken planks and tattered sails. Few dared to venture near the dockyard, especially after sundown. They spoke of a thick fog that would roll in off the sea at dusk, shrouding the crumbling docks in an eerie silence. But those who had been too curious or too bold whispered of hearing strange sounds, distant, hollow knocks, like ghostly hammering, and the mournful creak of wooden beams bending under unseen weight. And then there were the voices, low, disembodied murmurs that seemed to echo from beneath the dark waters. One such curious soul was Caleb Monroe, a historian with a penchant for the supernatural. Caleb had heard the stories of the dockyard's cursed past and felt a strange pull, a compulsion to uncover the secrets buried within its rotting timbers. Armed with a lantern and a notebook, he set out one foggy evening, determined to document the truth. As he approached the dockyard, the mist thickened around him, swallowing the moonlight and deadening all sound. The air was heavy with the scent of brine and decay. Caleb could barely make out the outline of the crumbling warehouses and the skeletal remains of ships long past their prime. His heart pounded with a mix of fear and excitement. He paused at the entrance, where an old, rusted chain dangled from a gate that hung awkwardly on its hinges. It swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. Caleb swallowed hard and stepped inside. The air grew colder, and he felt an inexplicable chill crawl up his spine. The ground beneath his feet was soft, wet with a strange, oily substance. His lantern flickered as if struggling against an unseen force. Caleb moved deeper into the dockyard, the shadows closing in around him. He heard the soft lapping of water against the docks and then, unmistakably, the faint sound of a hammer striking metal. The noise was distant, coming from the direction of an old shipwreck that lay half submerged in the murky water. Curiosity overwhelmed his fear, and he made his way toward the sound. As he neared the wreck, the hammering stopped, replaced by a low whispering that seemed to come from all directions. Caleb's lantern flickered again, and for a brief moment, he saw them, shadowy figures moving through the fog, their forms distorted and twisted. They seemed to be wearing old-fashioned sailor attire, their faces obscured by darkness. His heart raced as he realized they were moving towards him, their whispers growing louder, more urgent. He stumbled backward, nearly dropping his lantern. The fog seemed to thicken, and he felt a strange pressure in his ears, as if the air itself was vibrating with an unseen energy. He turned to leave, but his feet wouldn't move. It was as if something held him in place, rooting him to the spot. He looked down and saw the oily substance had spread around his shoes, a thick, black sludge that seemed to pulse and writhe with a life of its own. Panic surged through Caleb. He pulled his foot free with a great effort, the sludge clinging to his boot like tar. He began to run, but the fog seemed to push back against him, making every step feel like a struggle. The whispers grew louder, now clearer, filled with anguish and anger. They spoke of betrayal, of death, of souls lost to the sea. Caleb felt a cold hand brush against his shoulder and spun around, but there was no one there. The dockyard seemed to shift around him, the fog twisting into shapes that looked like reaching arms, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. He could hear the sound of water bubbling as if something was rising from the depths. Then he saw it, an old ship, larger than any he had ever seen, emerging slowly from the mist. Its sails were torn, and its hull was covered in barnacles and seaweed. The ship seemed to glow with an unnatural light, and on its deck stood a crew of spectral figures, their eyes hollow and glowing like embers. Caleb felt a pull, a compulsion to move toward the ship. He resisted, but his feet began to move on their own. The whispers turned to cries, and he realized they were calling his name.
Caleb! Caleb, join us.
The voices echoed in his mind, relentless, and he felt a sharp pain in his head. He reached the edge of the dock, his feet just inches from the dark water. The ship loomed closer, its ghostly crew reaching out with skeletal hands. Caleb felt a cold hand grasp his wrist, pulling him forward. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the fog. The lantern fell from his grasp, hitting the dock with a dull thud, its light extinguished in an instant. The last thing Caleb saw before darkness took him was the face of a woman on the ship's deck, her eyes filled with sorrow and rage. She mouthed a single word:
"Remember."
When Caleb didn't return, the townsfolk whispered of yet another soul claimed by the forgotten dockyard. His lantern was found the next morning, lying at the edge of the dock, covered in that strange, oily sludge. No sign of Caleb was ever found, but some say if you venture too close to the dockyard on a foggy night, you might hear his voice joining the chorus of whispers, warning all who listen of the curse that still lingers in the mist.